I'm Sally Pointer. Next in my series of videos on early style Nalbinding is a very interesting stitch that actually sits part way between Nalbinding and basketry and netting. Follow along with me as we make this Tybrind Vig style basket, bag, bowl, not quite sure what it is yet, see what it turns into. When I made my video on simple looping, we were exploring the idea that the earliest forms of Nalbinding probably started as cordage projects. So you start making your cord at the centre or the edge of a project, and as you go around you add more cordage to it. So you make a bit of cordage, take a few stitches, make a bit of cordage, take a few stitches. And the end result is a very simple looped open proto-Nalbinding, if you will, simple looping, buttonhole stitch, lots of different ways of describing it, and it's very effective stuff, but it does stretch in every direction, and that's not always what you want in a project. There is another looping style from very early in prehistory which addresses this stretch, and that's looping over a core. Now this one's got some of my nettle fibre from last year in it, so I couldn't be bothered to take it out. And generally, when I work this technique, I tend to work it quite densely, quite finely. And I find it's brilliant for things like bags, it makes great hats, it makes really good strainers. I'm going to challenge myself today to make something a little bit chunkier, a little bit more open work. And we're going to see how it comes out using line bast. The same basic idea, we're going to cord as we go, but rather than the open looping that we did in the previous video, we're going to work over a core which stops it stretching in one direction and gives us a lot more stability in others. Now the inspiration for this project comes from a brilliant site. This is Tybrind Vig, which I'm probably pronouncing badly, which is a Mesolithic site in Denmark. This book is particularly lovely, but there's also quite a lot online about it. And one of the things that was found there were quite a lot of textile or basketry type items, including these looped around a core elements in tree bast. Now they might be willow, they might be poplar, they might be lime bast. It's lime I'm going to use today. Until very recently, they'd assumed this was a variation on Nalbinding, and that is certainly the context that I still tend to think about it in. They're now starting to group it more with basketry techniques, but to be honest, I think that's splitting hairs, really. I think anybody who works with looped textiles will very quickly see the relationship between this and what we tend to think of as early forms of Nalbinding today. So this is the inspiration for today's project, and what I'm going to be using is lime bast. Now I've got a lovely lot of this. I've been very fortunate that although my own batches aren't ready yet, I've got a couple of friends who've been supplying me with bast. And the strips of bark get retted, they get submerged in water for, well, several months in some cases. It can take as little as weeks, until the strands separate out. Now if you fancy trying this and you haven't got lime bast available, you could use raffia if you want something board, you could use nettle fibres, you could use horseradish fibres, pretty much any cordage fibre that you personally have access to will work for this. What I tend to do is just very slightly dampen these before I start. They don't have to be wet. Just a little tiny bit of flexibility does help, and it splits into lots and lots of ribbons. So I'm not going to go through cordage in any huge detail as part of this, but I'll just give you a very quick refresher as how I tend to do things. So your bast, or whatever fibres you're using, you could use flax, hemp, really anything you've got available. I tend to split down into relatively small ribbons, and then the cordage that I'm working on, if I get to the working end, I always tend to join new bits in by finding more or less a centre point, laying it right across the bundle, and then twisting and laying in that cordage. This gives me relatively few sticky out bits. It means the splice point is strong. And I can make my cordage pretty much infinitely long. Now I've started by making quite a large bundle of cordage here. And the reason for that is because I want to make the core of this particular bag in more or less one stretch. The working end, the bit that's going to be making the loops, I'm going to have to add more cordage to as I go. But I spent a couple of hours yesterday making, not sure how much is on here, there's probably 10 or 15 yards of cordage on there, trying to keep it relatively even. And for me, this is really chunky cordage. Normally I make very, very fine string of different sizes, but for me this is chunky, and I did want to challenge myself today to make a really big, thick, heavy bit of netting. So let's get this set up. I will try later on and recap the technique using off the peg string, so bought cordage, for those of you who like the idea of trying the technique but don't want to make your own cordage. Otherwise the basic principle will be the same throughout. I'll just tie you down and we'll get started. There's always a trade-off when you do looped as you go textiles. The more cordage you have made in advance, the faster you can get on with your actual project. The longer your cordage is though, the more you have to pull through at each point, and that can be very annoying and can lead to tangles. So I've measured off probably about 5 fathoms. A fathom is the distance between your outstretched arms, standardised at 6 foot today, but I was taught as a child that it was the distance you can encompass in a hug, which I quite like. That's going to be the core of my basket. And I'm just winding this into a ball to keep it tidy, to keep it out of the way. I'm getting some cockling on the end here where the twist is folding back on itself. So I'm just going to pull that through my hands to release the excess twist, because I don't want that interfering with my cordage when I get to it. Okay, so that's left me 1, 2, maybe 2 fathoms. I'll wind a bit more on. So I don't really want to be irritated by having loads of leftover cordage, but I want to be able to take a good few stitches before we start working. So I have a ball of cordage with a loose end. This end is going to be the core. This end is going to be my working end. Now I'm right-handed, so I'm going to be working in this direction, but it really doesn't matter if you're left-handed and want to work this way around. So to start off, I'm going to fold my working piece roughly in half, leaving my ball with the core thread just trailing on the floor. This is my loose end. And I'm going to make buttonhole stitches. So I'm just going to come around, pull through, essentially a simple overhand knot. Now this is my foundation row, so I need to make enough to be able to bend this round into a circle. And this will also set the size of the loops I made. Now, as I said, I'm trying to challenge myself to work in quite a chunky fashion today. I want quite a big, heavy, open work net bag at the end of this that I can use for carrying quite large things. So I've got 4 stitches on there so far. 1, 2, 3, 4. I think to be able to work round in circle, I'm going to need, let's try 6 or 7. So all I'm taking is whatever end is convenient, under my core thread, back up through the loop it makes. The exact number of stitches you start with is really relatively irrelevant. Most people tend to find that 6, 7, 8, something like that is about right. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. I think one more will do it. And when I can come round in a circle, I need to remind myself what direction I'm working in. So I could keep just going around this way, but for me it's more natural to flip it over so that I'm coming this way. Now from here on in, as well as going over my core thread, I want to be going through a loop of the previous row. So with a finer cord, you might use a needle. I'm just going to bend my cordage so that it goes through. So poke that through the hole. We've gone over the cord, back down through, and at this point I can use my centre cord to snug up that middle. I want a nice tight middle to this. Now the general formula with anything worked and around in a nail binding type technique is on the first round you want to increase. So I've gone into this loop once, I'm going to go into it again. The next loop I'm going to go into twice. The next loop I'm going to go into twice. So that was one. I'm poking through my loop, making sure I've gone over the core thread. Otherwise the core just sits there, it doesn't really do anything. Every row or so you'll give it a little tweak to make sure you've got the right amount sitting in it. Right, now I've got 2 stitches in this one. I can move on to the next. I always think it was a flower petal, so on to the next petal. So poke my working thread down into it, over my core thread, back up. It is just a simple loop. That was one loop. That's another one. Now we'll go on to the next petal. Poking down into it, looping through. So I'm going to do this first bit quite slowly until we get to the end of the working section. And then from there on in I'll speed up and I'll just film every few rows so that you can see how progress is coming along. But certainly for this first round I'm working twice into each petal, loop, lobe, doesn't really matter how you think of it, but it's this bottom section. Looks a bit like a pretzel if you want to think of it in those terms. And all the time we're getting closer to the raw end of my cordage. Just make sure you keep trapping that centre cord down the middle. Two into that one. Two into that one. Probably a little over halfway round now. So there's 1, 2, at least 3 more loops before I've got round to the starting point. Sometimes it's a little hard to see where your starting point ends up, but you don't have to overthink this sort of technique. It really is something that you can just feel your way through. Keep looking at it. Does it look as if you've got round to the end? I can see that I'm not quite there yet. And I'm coming up quite fast. Oops. On the unmade part of my cordage. This is why you want to work with as long a length as you conveniently can, because it might look as if you've got a lot of cordage, but you are going to go through it really, really quickly. One of these days I'll do a project where I actually measure exactly how much has gone into it. It's, right, one more. I think we are all the way around that first loop. So this is giving me a fairly flat base to my bag. Now, I'm not after something over huge, but I want it to be fairly big. So I think on the next round, I'm going to work 2 into the first loop, 1 into the second, 2 into the third, 1 into the fourth, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1. That's going to keep it increasing If it happens to be curving slightly up, that's absolutely fine. So I've got to the end. Now is the time to check. If I pull that centre cord too much, that's going to really tighten my bag before I need to. So as I'm trying to work flat at the moment, we'll give it a wiggle, make sure that that's just sitting nice and calmly. Now, I'm nearly out of cordage on the end. So I'm going to put this bit down and I'm going to spend the next few minutes adding to my cordage. So I'm going to add some bits to the end, twist and cross, twist and cross. If you haven't made cordage before, I do have a whole series of videos on making cordage from all sorts of materials, and I do recommend you have a go at that. It's quite satisfying to make your own. It doesn't necessarily take a very long time either. The important thing for a project like this is to try and keep it relatively even. And on the scale that I'm working, it really doesn't take very, very long. So I'm going to keep making cordage for probably the next 10 minutes. I'm going to wait till I've got 2 or 3 more fathoms. Then I'm going to work my next round, which, just to remind you, is going to be 2 stitches, 1 stitch, 2 stitch, 1 stitch. I'll put the camera back on at the end of that and show you where we've got to. This is coming along quite well now. I think I've pretty much finished the increases. So on the very last row that I did 5 and then 2. So if I track back so that you can see that, there's 2 there, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 2 there, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And I think from here on in, I'm just going to work 1 into each one. If I turn this on its side, you can see it's just very, very gently starting to curl up at the edges. And that's going to be about perfect. I don't mind really at this stage whether that becomes the full width of the base or it ends up a little bit wider. So I'm just going to go round and round and round until we're at about the height that we want to be. One of the things I'm really enjoying about this are the really subtle stripes that's developing. It's because I'm using 2 different batches of bast. One batch is a slightly browny beige, one is a slightly orangey beige. Probably with time those will fade out, but for the moment I really like these subtle plays, and I do suspect that our early ancestors were much more attuned to subtleties in natural materials than we tend to be today. So I think that's something that they certainly would have recognised and hopefully appreciated. So I'm going to keep going exactly the same as before. My core thread is carrying along underneath. I'm going to keep going just with the same stitch, so poking it through, pulling it around underneath the core thread. I've got quite a long length on here now, so this will take a second to pull through. Adjusting my stitches as I go. I'll do one more because that last one was just a little bit crazy going through. So poking through the next loop, under the core thread, pulling it through and working with as long a length as I can at this moment. Don't think a longer length would be any better. It'll get shorter as I go though. There we are. So I'm going to just keep going round and round and round in circles, and the next time you see this, hopefully, will be very, very nearly finished. Well, I know I said that we'd be coming back to this when it was nearly done, but actually I've stopped here because I can't quite decide where to go next with it. I really like the shape it's got at the moment. We've got a really nice curve coming along at the side. I like the way the light shines through it. It's curling up really, really pleasingly. I could keep going and turn it into quite a substantial basket. I'm still trying to decide where exactly it fits. And I've certainly got enough of the core thread left to do a fair bit more. And of course, no problem at all with adding as much bast as I need to the cord in progress for the looping part. But I sort of quite like this. It might stay a shallow bowl. So I think I'm going to stop there for today. I'm going to see what you guys think. I'm going to finish up the video, get it out there. Post a comment for me. Tell me what you think it should be. Should it stay as a sort of shallow tray bowl thing? It would hold things like textile tools very nicely as it is. Should I keep going and turn it into a really substantial foraging bag basket thing? Also, what do you think it should be called? Is this Nalbinding, or be it a very early sort? Is it more likely to be basketry? Any better terminology for it? The jury does seem to be out a little bit as exactly where this particular technique sits. It's certainly very satisfying to work. I hope you'll have a go at it. Let me know how you get on, and I will do a future video on how to do this with off the peg cordage. I know I mentioned that earlier and never got around to it, but for now, have a lovely evening and enjoy your crafting.